Now, we all know about the basics of story structure, don't we? We all know without thinking about it, really, that there's a beginning, a middle, and an end. But do you often stop to think how important that knowledge is to you as an actor and how you can apply it to your craft? And yes, we know there's a beginning and a middle and an end, but how often do you stop to think that there is a fourth component to story structure? And that's a turning point. And turning points are really important too, and your understanding of them is an essential part of your skill. Now, when you think about the way a feature film is structured, then turning points are an essential part of that story structure. And although a feature film might start with a prologue, and the best example, my favourite example of that is Peter Weir's film Witness from 1985, when the prologue essentially runs behind the opening titles. But the most important thing about the three-act structure, which is generally where films start, is with an inciting incident. And it's the inciting incident that moves the protagonist from the standard world into an unusual one. It's the inciting incident that gets the story going. And what happens is that the protagonist will be dealing with the problems that issue that's created the inciting incident is generating. They keep dealing with those problems as best they can until you get to the first act turning point. And at the first act turning point, a new factor is introduced, which increases the difficulty of dealing with the problem. And so a new phase of the story commences. And the protagonist then continues to deal with this new level of difficulty through the second act until you get to the second act turning point where a new level of difficulty is introduced. One point of view is that the twist that happens, the second act turning point, is the darkest moment in the story for the protagonist. And although that could well be true, I don't think it's necessarily so, because what's going to happen is from that moment, the story difficulty is going to increase for the protagonist until they get to the point that they have to deal with the problem. And that's, of course, the climax of the story. So in the climax, the protagonist is dealing with the central issue in the circumstances and the relationship. Now, it's not necessarily the case that every film is structured with three acts. I recently watched Anthony Hopkins in The Father, and my view is that's a one-act story. It's the one problem that's continuing through to the end. But I've also recently watched I Care a Lot on Amazon Prime. And that's a three-act story, and the first act turning point in that story is really interesting because the protagonist doesn't actually have to deliver that. The storytellers deliver that because there's a moment in the story where we, the audience, suddenly realise that everything has changed. Now, that's a basic Hitchcock principle from my point of view, because he's the one that articulated the view that letting the audience know there's a bomb under the table while the characters don't know that is a really good tension-driving storytelling technique. So that's what the first act turning point is in I Care a Lot. But the second act turning point, when the difficulty escalates again and the story now travels in a new direction because of that increase in difficulty, the responsibility for delivering that turning point sits solely on the protagonist's shoulders. And Rosamund Pike does a fantastic job with this, because what happens is it's a moment of realisation. But it's such a big change that it takes her quite some time to work her way through to that realisation. And so what the actor has to deal with often in turning point moments are huge surprises. And Rosamund Pike does a fantastic job with this, because the scene that encompasses this turning point is 33 seconds long. And 24 seconds of that time is on her face as she works through that realisation. 24 seconds of screen time playing that surprise. And she does it exquisitely with demonstrating all the processes that we understand, all those wonderful things that Stanislavski revealed, are the key to the way a moment of surprise works for a person. So it's wonderfully believable. It does a fantastic job at elevating the difficulty in the story and heading it off in a new direction. So turning points in story structure are important for actors to understand, and they need to be confident with their skills at playing surprises so that they can deliver them. There's another aspect to turning points, and that is, how do you deal with a turning point in a scene? And I'm going to deal with that in Talking Acting next week, 5:45 next Tuesday. See you then.